webinar. We hope you'll enjoy the presentation. For our returning guests, welcome back. We're glad you can join us. Our topic today is practical RPO, getting real benefits from an RPO program. I'm delighted to be joined by our returning star presenters, Matt Rivera and Andy Roane. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website at rpoassociation.org. Second, if you have questions during the event, please post them to our GoToMeeting channel, chat panel. Speakers will answer your questions during and after the presentation. Lastly, we will be tweeting during this event with hashtag #PracticalRPO. Before we dive into our topic, I would like to introduce our speakers. We are very thrilled to have back Matt and Andy from Yo. Andy Roane is the Vice President of Recruitment Process Outsourcing for Yo. Andy brings more than 15 years of human capital industry experience to the role, including 6 years as Vice President of Operations for People Scout, where he led RPO engagements with Fortune 500 companies. Matt Rivera serves as Vice President of Marketing and Communications and is responsible for overseeing all aspects of Yo's marketing and brand communications. Matt holds a degree in journalism and public relations and has been working in the staffing industry for more than 25 years. Prior to this role, Matt held many different roles from branch recruiting and proposal writing to technology management and online marketing. Now, without any further ado, I will pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, Lamise. I appreciate the introductions, and it's great to be here. We appreciate the help of the RPOA in doing these series of webinars. I think they're great for anybody looking to learn more about RPO and some of the things that we do. So we're excited today to share with you this topic on practical RPO, because I think there's a lot of things out there about RPO, but what we really want to do today is talk about the practical benefits and some examples. So I'm pleased to be joined by Andy. Andy, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks, Matt.
Right. And we're gonna get into our topic here really shortly. Let me go through the agenda, and I just want to give you an idea of what's coming. We always talk about our key takeaways first, because we believe that you don't have to wait till the end to get all the good stuff, and it helps you when you're going through to listen for some of the things that we're going to emphasize as we go through today. So we're going to kind of set a baseline with why RPO and the value proposition for RPO to kind of level set. So Andy's going to walk us through that, talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to go through 3 situations that many companies find themselves in today. I think they're very common. I think that Andy's done a fantastic job of kind of lining up some of the things that we do on a daily basis and turning them into practical examples of how RPO can be a good solution for your company. So I think we've got some great stuff there. And then we're going to end up today with just give you an idea of the needs, how you take a look at what you really need and align it with your business objectives and connect them and get really started on that next step. And just before we go too far, and I'll mention it later, we did another webinar that we have on the Yo site that speaks to how you actually create the business case and talk to the C-level about RPO. So I think that's a great next step. And then obviously we'll take some questions at the end. So just by way of introduction of the topic here, before we dive into everything, and we'll look at the key takeaways here, but just really there's a couple of major driving forces that are really driving why companies are looking towards RPO and other recruiting, outsourcing to really approach the talent marketplace. And it's because there's this really huge need for skilled employees in this competitive market that we're in. In fact, I think just yesterday, the BLS, put out the statistics saying 5.4 million job openings in April, which is the largest in 14 years, which is pretty significant and good for everybody. But really what that does is it says, well, gosh, it's going to be really competitive out there, number one. And number two, there's always this continual push to reduce talent acquisition costs while becoming more efficient. And you put those together, and it really creates a lot of pressure for talent acquisition leaders. So how do you gain a competitive advantage in talent acquisition while reducing your talent acquisition budget, right? So it's a big, tall order here. So today we're going to look at how a few companies have addressed these and the real value of an RPO partnership and how some of these were structured. And I think one of the most, one of the biggest takeaways you can have that's not actually on this list of takeaways, but is how it changes over time, how transformational it is, because it really is interesting when you think about it in terms of how it transforms over time. So we're going to talk about that. So let me give you the 4 key takeaways here before we get into it. And I have a question. Andy's going to give us a little baseline about RPO, and then I've got a question for you guys. So number 1 key takeaway here is RPO is unique, and it is as unique as your culture and your company, and it should be. And I think you're going to hear that today in the examples that we have. There's this idea of scaling up and scaling down, and that's a great use for RPO, but you're going to hear that it's more than just volume. It's more than just the numbers of hires. It's about quality, and quality can mean a lot of things: quality process, quality candidates, quality experience for your candidates. Number 3 there, it can improve all or part of your recruiting processes. I think hopefully you know that. That's why process is in the name when you look at RPO, but really the value is building the long-term process improvement. And again, as I said, in that transformational way, it changes, right? And then this is a great first step. So RPO, if you're taking this step or you haven't taken this step yet, it's a great first step in improving your talent acquisition processes, and you need to connect that to how that helps your company, how talent is critical to achieving your company's goals. And that should really be something when we look at RPO that we keep in mind. So Andy, why don't you give us a baseline for what's driving this need for an outsourced RPO solution before we get into some of the great examples that we have today?
Perfect. Great place to start, Matt. And I think you touched on it in your introduction, that companies are looking for any competitive advantage and cost savings opportunity that's out there. And so engaging an RPO partner provides significant value in both of these areas, both in improving the quality candidates as well as reducing costs. But one of the things that we're going to hear today is that there's many other advantages as well, including that point that you made, building long-term process improvement. And the best way to understand really the extent of the value of RPO is to look at what some of the leading companies are doing with their RPO partners.
Right, and I think one of the things we'll certainly talk a little bit in the specific examples we have about where it can have impact. But when we're talking about that and what we do with RPO, where else can RPO have an impact, and how does that kind of evolve over time?
Well, I think you're asking the number 1 question that talent acquisition leaders ask themselves when evaluating their strategy. So many talent acquisition leaders are challenged to answer this question because the value of an RPO partnership can be as varied as the comparisons of one company culture to the next. So, again, traditionally, companies have engaged RPOs to reduce their cost per hire by outsourcing, and again, traditionally high volume roles, and to provide recruiting expertise for those difficult to fill positions. But the value of an RPO partnership has evolved, as you can see on your screen with this graphic. It can now have strategic impact on the business by ensuring the optimal deployment of this talent. So companies have figured out that they can optimize their talent through the alignment of the talent acquisition resources, the RPO team, with the overall business strategy. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and like how does that alignment actually work. So a real quick preview, this can manifest itself in such ways as having just-in-time talent or robust talent pipelines. So organizations and RPO providers are coming closer together. They're teaming up to build the business case for sustained investment in these types of things. Because if you think about it, a requisition when it opens is a very obvious need, but actually setting aside budget dollars for a talent pipeline team is entirely different. So in some cases, these pipeline teams are completely different and they're a whole separate entity than a actual recruiting department that is acting on an open requisition. These, in the best case scenarios, these talent pipeline teams are separate and would never be filling these open requisitions, but instead engaging this particular talent. The optimal deployment of the talent also means that companies are looking beyond their static employment brand. Now, one of the things you constantly hear in the marketplace is companies focusing on their employment brand, but some of the leading companies are actually going beyond employment brand and defining employment brand as a one-way conversation of the company towards the potential candidate or a future employee. Forward-thinking companies are actually saying, my employment brand needs to be a two-way conversation, which is where these talent pipeline teams come in. So the expertise of an RPO partner can help the company build the business case and then deploy the operations to make this happen. So, Matt, all that said, the best way to address your question is really to take a look at some specific examples of some RPO partnerships and the value that the RPO provided and how these partnerships evolved. And I think, that's some of the detail that we're going to get to in the presentation today.
Yeah, and that's great. And there's a great baseline. So, so for our audience, as you're kind of listening through to these examples, just kind of think back to this slide here when we talk about this evolution, because really, if you're thinking it's a kind of one and done thing, and you're not really thinking how this changes over time or how it changes, then you could be missing something, or, and I think we really have that set out. So here's what I want to do before we dive in. I have a question for those of you on the phone right now. If you could help me out with this, I'm going to launch a poll here, and I just have a simple question for you, and just take a second to answer this question. How would you describe your current talent acquisition processes? And we don't look at the results by person or anything, so be honest. Let me know. So I'm going to launch this poll right now. All right, and I'll give you just a few seconds, or let's give you maybe a minute to see how you feel about your current talent acquisition processes. It's always very interesting and also very difficult. How you assess those, right? So, and that's at the end of this, we're also going to give you some idea of how to assess that. But I'm always curious to see what some of the outliers are on this one. So I'll give you another 10 seconds, and then I'm going to close it, and then I'm going to share the results with you. All right, so last one in, so I'm going to close it, and I'm going to share those results. So if you take a quick look here, that you can see, and I think what this shows is that it's really probably, and Andy, I don't know what you think, not a black and white thing, right? It's not, hey, we're in trouble, I don't have any idea, or wow, we are just killing it. It's highly effective, but it's somewhere in the middle. Somewhat effective, but could improve is the largest, and then pretty effective and working well, and then some realization of with some of you that it's not effective or that efficient. So,
well, I think this is really good because we're going to be able, we've got a number of examples that address each of these categories. So it's, I think we're on track with a lot of what we're going to be talking about today.
Awesome. All right, so here's what we'll do. Let's dive right into it. So we'll dive right into our example number one, and in this case, so I'll kind of give you some of the background here and what we're talking about. and what we're looking at. So in this case, it's an RPO engagement we have with a well-known manufacturing company, and when we began this partnership, I think we really characterize it as, they had a really robust recruiting team, and by most standards, they were doing pretty well. They were considered to be top performing. 700 hires annually is a lot. 20 recruiters is certainly a lot, but many of these positions were difficult to fill and located in small markets, which is always a challenge, right? And they had their talent acquisition structured by business unit, so that the 20 that they had there were, recruiters and coordinators, recruiting and sourcing, and doing all the end-to-end process with that. And the challenge was how to build efficiency in the model. So how do you gain efficiency, with their recruiting resources and recruiting technology, especially as you go through time and, let's say you go through the past few years when there's huge budget pressures, right? The bottom line becomes the bottom line is how can we make this, more efficient and, address these budget pressures that we have. So Andy, kind of take us through a little bit of, how this organization came to us and how we transformed, or how we kind of evolved this process over time. I think this is really good.
Yeah, they came to us with that focus on cost reduction. And again, that's the simple entry point really for most engagements. But what's interesting about how this partnership started with that cost reduction focus, and then where it is today, which is really a focus on best-in-class talent acquisition process with a heavy emphasis on candidate quality. And this heavy emphasis on candidate quality is really driven through the engagement between the recruiters and the hiring managers. They're highly connected. And when you think about that type of engagement, which is really important, whether you're outsourcing your talent or not, truly the recruiting team has to be that extension of the hiring managers. Otherwise, the real simple statement is the hiring managers would do it themselves if they had the time and the capacity. Right. But you develop that talent acquisition team to be an extension of the hiring managers. And so as the hiring managers get more focused on their higher level of talent, they then engage the recruiters appropriately, and that quality then is driven up.
I think, yeah, it's very interesting you say that. We'll certainly in the other examples, and as we get through this, we'll see that hiring manager engagement in there. But I think what was really interesting to me about this one was that while they wanted to reduce their costs, and that was kind of like, as you said, the entry point, I think, but weren't they also unwilling to outsource certain aspects of their recruiting? They kind of had it under control, but they were really unwilling to let some of that go to us?
Right. And as you said, they were doing a good job with their recruiting beforehand. If they had taken that poll, they would have had things locked down and doing well, but there's room for improvement. And what we know when you take a look at 700 hires, but even if you're less than 50 hires a year, the numbers start adding up over the course of time when there is marginal improvement both in process as well as cost reduction. So both in terms of your resources as well as out-of-pocket costs for, let's say, sourcing or technology. But they were pretty strategic about their engagement. They knew that the highest value that the recruiting team brought to the organization was that engagement of their recruiters with the hiring managers. The recruiters had built solid relationships with the hiring managers, and there was trust between the two groups, and they didn't want to disrupt that trust. So in our initial discussions, they were very apprehensive about what it means to outsource. They weren't clear about the balance of the RPO value with and the possible negative implications of outsourcing on their organization. So we started with very deliberate steps and ensured that the change management impact on the organization was minimal.
Yeah, so I think that's a great example of how it's unique to the company's situation and how you have to address those things. I like the way that the solution from the beginning to minimize that impact on the organization and preserve the value that they already had inherent in what they were doing. And you would think that that would have been like, oh, hey, we got it all under control, but there's still an opportunity there for RPO to provide value, and structuring it so that the team supporting the recruiters maintain the relationship with the hiring managers is pretty interesting. So let's talk about how RPO had an impact, and where it changed things a little bit, and how you structured it.
So if you think about it, we preserved that partnership between their internal team of recruiters with the hiring managers, and we structured our partnerships so that we were providing the advertising, the sourcing, and administrative support. And we were able to provide immediate cost savings by segmenting the recruiting work into a center of excellence and allowing the recruiters to focus on selection and hiring manager relationships, or I should say the internal recruiters, their recruiters that they were keeping in place. We ended up taking as much as 60% of these internal recruiters' workload off of them and placed it in the COE, thereby keeping the high-value work, the relationships with the hiring managers, with the higher compensated recruiters. Their top-performing internal recruiters were then able to take on more responsibility, more relationships, with a much more narrow job focus. Our team then worked side by side with their team in a joint effort to ultimately meet their talent acquisition goals.
So really, we were kind of working behind the scenes to minimize that initial change that we had to deal with. And would you say the hiring managers didn't even know some of these changes were happening?
For the most part, they didn't. We were working behind the scenes, but we didn't keep it a secret. But the hiring manager workflow and the contacts within the recruiting department didn't change at all.
Right. So that's a really interesting point. But let's so just keep things moving here. Let's fast forward and talk about how how you established this relationship and the value that they got, and then give us a little bit of behind the scenes and this cost reduction and how and where it is today. And I think that really the interesting story here as you go through and you talk about this evolution and some of the critical things that happened and changed is how we got from hey, we just want to save some money to be more efficient, to a technology enhanced, scalable, and best in class recruiting solution, right?
Yeah. So two key points here to fast forward, as you said. This story starts becoming one of a greater partnership and two organizations being really closely aligned, and then how this type of partnership actually evolves, and the evolution then produces more value to the in this particular case, this manufacturing company. So there were two critical junctures in our partnership which allowed it to evolve quickly. The first was involved this company's need to expand that internal recruiting team that they had. And then the second involved our execution on advertising and sourcing. So now one of the things to keep in mind is, most talent acquisition teams are faced with unplanned events. Workforce planning, everybody tries to do it, but the reality is it's difficult to get that information. This company was really no different than that. But in this particular situation, they truly had an event. This company made an acquisition of another business. The new business had little recruitment infrastructure, and they knew that when two businesses came together, as did in this case, that it could possibly result in turnover, and they wanted to be prepared for that. So this company was ready to actually expand this internal recruiting team, their recruiters, when we actually proposed a solution to provide the recruiters for this new organization. So this would be a scalable solution, which meant our team would be able to expand and contrast with the needs of this new organization. Now, without great insight into the long-term needs of the acquired company, it made a ton of sense for them when they looked at our proposal to not permanently add to their fixed cost recruitment infrastructure. So Yo was able to easily absorb the sourcing, advertising, and administrative roles. We had already been doing that for the previous organization. All we did was expand that and scale it to the new organization. And now we were able to also provide the dedicated say, direct contact with a hiring manager recruitment solution as well. So based on this new role, and as the company continued to expand, and as their current talent acquisition team experienced a minor turnover, our partner continually turned to provide us with top performing talent, and we started providing their entire organization with hiring managers facing recruiters. So they started to dwindle down their internal recruitment team, and our team started taking on those roles until we reached the point where we are today, where we have a fully outsourced solution, end-to-end solution. So this entire group of recruiters who interact with the hiring managers are now fully outsourced. The team of recruiters is also fully flexible to scale for those unexpected changes in their business.
Wow. So what a change, right? So, you know, and one of the interesting things here is that kind of just to remind everybody is to go back, and I don't know if we mentioned this earlier, but the fluctuations in annual hires, they certainly had a lot of, a large volume of hires, but I believe, there was a lot of fluctuation. Let's say it's, give or take plus or minus 30% change in year over year, increase or decrease. So, when you have that set fixed recruitment, resource model, that you have 20 recruiters sitting there, you have this, this whole infrastructure set up. That's huge. Those are huge cost implications when you compare that fixed cost that they have to now the flexible model that they have in place today. And, and then you're also thinking about, well, how can we, bring some other enhancements through, just our sourcing expertise and the things that we're good at. And I think it's really pretty amazing that you transformed from that fully, in-house type of recruiting model that they thought was okay to a really flexible model that was actually better than what they had, right?
That's exactly it. So an increase in value for them, increased flexibility, but what really started off as this behind-the-scenes sourcing support administrative model turned into a technology-enhanced engagement. We were able to quickly bring best practices from our experiences with other clients into this partnership, which I think is, it's again one of the key value propositions for an RPO is that we get the opportunity to try and test and partner with a lot of different technology providers within this space. So prior to our engagement, this company had a basic yet pretty effective approach to advertising and sourcing. And then through our technology execution, our initial engagement, this client turned to us to gain additional insight into additional recruiting technology enhancements. One of the things that we hear time and time again is really the struggle that these companies have with navigation and navigation through all the technology providers, all the technology salespeople that are out there, and it's a difficult choice to make when you don't have that experience, and it's difficult to evaluate all the different options. And so what we were able to do is make it really easy and streamlined for them by bringing technology partners to the table and then pointing them in the right direction based on our firsthand experience.
And I think that what I like most about this story is how it moved from kind of the idea of sourcing execution and that helping them, and you were kind of behind the scenes to a partnership that, and this, right, I mean, Andy, this involved like CRM, video interviewing, applicant tracking, system administration. I mean, when you talk technology, you're talking about, a lot of that we brought, correct?
Right. And again, this is all about the partnership of coming together and evaluating the technology possibilities. And again, a lot of our experience that we bring from work with other clients ends up benefiting this particular client in this particular example.
Yeah, and I think if we circle back, right, this is really that value evolution and that slide we had in the beginning, and it started out as, hey, we're thinking about cost reduction and we want to make this, just a little cheaper, or, maybe we didn't know where it's going to go tomorrow, but, then it turned to end-to-end scalable solution that allows for, improvement over time, improvement in technology, improvement in efficiency that really ultimately, created flexibility for them, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things, the key to that is that, you're talking about over time, you're talking about, both parties evolving together, but both parties recognizing that the partnership is really critical in alignment between the two organizations. We know that, like this client experience and so many other companies similar to it are challenged at the beginning with trying to figure out how to create the perfect structure of a strategic RPO partnership. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but what you have to be continuously focused on is that continuous improvement and continuous ROI. This company took the right steps at the beginning by identifying their core competency. And in this case, if you remember that, it was the recruiter and the hiring manager relationships, and they kept that portion of the recruiting structure in place. So they identified that, they said this has to stay. They knew that that was of great value to the key stakeholders. And then through the partnership evolution, trust, and then our performance, that partnership evolved into the full outsourced solution it is today, which ends up maximizing the value. I think there's a couple key takeaways here for all of you in the webinar to think about, and that is solutions change. RPO solutions change, they evolve. RPO solutions are unique, so Matt mentioned that at the beginning, and I think that's one of those situations. This is not cookie cutter in any one of these situations. The third thing is really that the challenges that this company had fitting the two organizations together ultimately changed as well as the solution changed. And then the value that this company realized at the end was not what it started with. And so again, with a good RPO partner, you're going to realize long-term value and not that just the short one-time bursts. So much of what we hear in the marketplace, in the RPO marketplace, doesn't reflect the reality of RPO engagement. As stated on one of the previous slides, RPO is not just for large enterprises seeking end-to-end solutions. The recruiting solutions provided by an RPO can fit nearly any organization with any recruitment structure, and those top-performing engagements will evolve.
Yeah, I think this has been a really good example. That's why we spent a little bit more time on this one, because I think it's a really good example of that. I would remind everybody out there that if you do have questions, there is a question box in your webinar panel there. You might have to, if it's gone to the side, you might have to hit the little red arrow and get it back out. If you'd like to ask a question, we'll certainly take some questions at the end. But let's move on to another situation here that I think is interesting as well. So this is the previous example we had was a strong recruiting organization within a mid-sized company, and you saw how they moved to another level, and they were able to take it to the next level, and we were able to help them. So let's take a look at something a little bit different. This is a mid-sized company, and it's an international company, and ongoing talent needs within a very specific space, the biotech space. And typical of what we see today, and certainly we would, many mid-sized companies hope to be fast-growing, but they generally are, and certainly in tech areas. And what happens, right, is this company outgrew their human resource infrastructure, and due to their growth, they expanded HR, which is, again, typical. You try to do the right things. You have a lot of new employees. You're trying to get everybody together, and you're growing quickly. But I think that, when we talk about this, and what you're going to, hear from some of the situation here is that they expanded their human resources and talent acquisition team together as one unit. So really you had human resources professionals performing some recruiter tasks, which again is not out of the ordinary, but ultimately they didn't segment their human resources from talent acquisition. We can talk a little bit about that, and consequently, that your talent acquisition efforts can suffer, and the associated cost, if you see the last bullet here, using search agencies. So I think this should sound familiar to many companies today, Andy. So, talk a little bit about this example, and then we can get to the solution here as what we did to help them.
Yeah. So what I like about this example is that the value of the engagement with the RPO provider seems terribly obvious. I think had this company taken the poll, they would have been in that category where they needed a lot of help, and they were using a lot of search agencies. Talent acquisition execution within this organization was marginal, costs were high, the business had resigned itself to either paying a lot for talent through the use of those search firms or suffering through subpar performance by the human resources team. What's important to note here is that, again, this example is not that uncommon, but this example is not defined by the very real cost savings this company achieved by eliminating the search firms. So that's just really phase one, or the initial step of what an RPO can provide and what we provided them. The long-term value, the year-over-year increase in value, was based on the connection of the talent acquisition team to the business through recruitment data, technology implementation, hiring manager relationships, in a business case presentation to an executive level. The YO team was able to tie business outcomes to talent acquisition success. Together, we formulated this talent acquisition strategy, which involved building talent communities, and most importantly, we were able to efficiently involve the hiring managers in sourcing and employment value proposition communication efforts.
So, that's really interesting there. Can you give us some more details on that? I think that's a really important point there.
Yeah, so thanks for stopping me. I think there's a couple different things that happened here, and more tactical types of steps that we actually took. The first thing is that the company ID'd a specific talent need, and we were, we were sitting at the table with them in strategic meetings about how they, or what type of talent they actually needed. And so this is not a situation where a requisition is simply lobbed over to the RPO team, or if you have an internal team, it's lobbed over to the talent acquisition team. This was truly the executive team, the hiring manager stakeholders, and YO as the recruitment outsource provider coming together and sitting down, creating an actual strategy, and together talking about the evaluation of talent in the marketplace through discussions with those hiring managers. Hiring managers were fully engaged and truly understood the types of individuals that they needed to hire. The problem is that they couldn't obviously just go out and recruit them themselves. So together we developed a real clear picture of what it would take to engage that talent. And then by leading talent acquisitions with the hiring managers, the engagement of really top quality passive candidates dramatically increased. The key to this was to engage the hiring managers without putting that dramatic requests for their time and their involvement. So we leveraged some of the best technology using video combined with resources such as LinkedIn to tap new pools of talent. The recruiters were able to use the hiring manager video resources to initiate conversations with qualified candidates who, probably never would have taken a recruiter call. So by building the talent acquisition infrastructure, driving continuous improvement through joint efforts between the client and YO, our client was able to realize year-over-year increases in the value coming from their talent acquisition team.
Wow, and I think you hit on a couple of really important points there about that we talked about in the last example too, is that engagement of the hiring manager, right, to make sure they're part of this process and how that was leveraged there, and then bringing in some of those enablers, like technology that you can't just rely on technology, but you have to have all of those other things in place. But that's how you really increase the value. So that's a really great example, and I think it's again, like you said, applies to many companies today with what they're doing. So let's move on to, we have a third example today that we wanted to talk about, and we'll take a deep dive into this one for a minute to look at how it can really change, how the changes that occur, and in this one I think, right, I think you'd agree with me that the change is really less kind of evolutionary and really transformational in this case.
Right.
So this is a global agribusiness corporation, big company. Over the course of the first 3 years, so the beginning of this engagement, we were providing end-to-end for a full spectrum of job categories, frontline operations, all the way up to positions just below the executive level. You see here, right from the slide, 375 hires annually about, and then fluctuation of about 20%, plus or minus. So large range of skills, some fluctuation there. Primarily structured as a cost per hire model, which gives them some flexibility, right, and shared risk with Yo as the RPO provider, with a sole RPO provider there. But then you're kind of walking this. The graphic kind of shows you're kind of walking this line, and then suddenly you have some transformations, right? And that's really kind of the key to this one.
Yeah, well, that's the key word, and that truly defines this, or the theme of this story is transformations, because they were pretty sudden. A number of these changes were actually based on some leadership changes, so both corporate leaderships as well as some talent acquisition leadership changes. In fact, the top talent acquisition leader changed. Up to this point, in the initial first few years of our engagement, it had been really, our role had been really consistent. As you described, the 375 hires a year were all U.S.-based, typically mid to senior level positions, and of these, about 90% of these were external hires. So then that transformation, that change happened where it directly impacted the entire talent team. It was determined that the business initiative that they were undertaking could only be supported by internally trained and educated employees, so only hiring from within. And so this company transformed its training department to actually be able to accommodate the forecasted talent need and get these team members from where they were right now to that next level. So our efforts went from targeting these mid to senior level positions, external positions, to a program that was really defined by college recruiting and a new internal mobility program. In addition, the remaining number of external hires, which became quite small at this point because of the change, were made in entirely different locations than originally where our original 375 hires came from. So this was really a reboot, and it was really a story about the flexibility that we had in this partnership change. So we have a particular level of pride in this particular program, as the change in the company's business objectives could not have been achieved without our support and the flexibility to make that happen. But what's most important was that this company had already established that we were a business partner based on our previous performance. And they gave us a seat at the table and allowed us to participate in the strategic discussions about capabilities, timing, and expertise. And really, if you think back to that first example, we were able to tap like that first example, we were able to tap our best practice experience, this time in the case of college recruiting and internal mobility programs, from our work with other clients. So we used that know-how to ensure that this program launched successfully.
Yeah, and I think you said it when you were talking about transformation. So you go from big change, right? External hires, all of those, to hey, we're trying to we're looking at internal mobility and college recruiting in a whole different area. And I think that's another good example of without a partner or a true partner in place, it might be hard to know what to do or how to do it, or would you start again? It's always that question: do I hire a bunch of people, and do we try to make it work, or do we lean on somebody who has that expertise? So I think that's I think it's a great story, and I think it's a great third example for us here. So let's start to kind of wrap up, and we'll take a couple of questions. Make sure we have some time at the for the end. But I have one question here, Andy, that we can take before we get into the wrap up. It says, how does a cost per hire model build partnership and commitment with the customer? So you're just doing that cost per hire thing. I think that's the essence of the question. How does that build that commitment with the customer, a partnership?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and probably takes more time than we have today. But let me get started on it to begin with. And if you need more information, we're happy to help you out somehow, some way. I'm sure we can connect with the person that asked this question. The great thing about a cost per hire model is really around the alignment of the objectives of the organization with the RPO provider. So if you think about that, the company actually has one goal, and that is to actually bring the appropriate talent on board. And if there is a cost per hire model in place, the RPO provider shares risks with that particular client partner because they only get paid when a hire is actually made. And so there could be a lot of work up front, everything from sourcing and screening and interview scheduling and all of those steps in the model. But when the actual payout is a cost per hire model, that shared risk is really the key to it, and truly is the definition of some of the great RPO models out there.
Yeah, good. And I think, that's that building that trust, right, as you're going through, because you're sharing that risk and you're kind of with them on that. So let's go to, we talked a little bit about in this, I think I forgot to change the slide here for the change in our situation 3, ability to change the focus of the program. So we covered that really well. So let's turn now, the common theme throughout these has been, how do we increase the value companies can realize through an engagement, with an RPO engagement with an RPO partner. And one of the previous webinars we hosted, again, that just a quick commercial, you can find that on our site. If you go to yo.com and you go to the RPO section, you can find it there. It's how do you build a case for RPO, and then communicate with C-level decision makers, and all of those questions. How do you evaluate, and what why is alignment critical? Those things. One of the things that came out of that we had from our guests, we had an excellent guest talent acquisition leader from a company, from one of our key clients, and really he said, one of the things he said that kind of stuck out as we were talking through this, as we were going through the presentation, was the key to this partnership success is engagement. It's successful business relationships involve these transparent communications and the use of business metrics to measure success and information sharing. It's about that transparency, and without these aspects, figuring out the ROI on the investment in an RPO solution becomes very difficult. And one of the key things I think that he said there was, it's a two-way street, and I think that that's kind of critical to how it really is supposed to work, so that you make sure that you're actually providing the value, you understand what that value is, you're working together, you're communicating up, you're communicating down, the hiring manager, the C-level, and then getting that alignment in there, which I know that is critical, right?
Absolutely, that is right on target. And the RPO provider, Matt, can be the driving force behind building the business case, which is what's needed when communicating with executive or C-level. The business metrics, including talent acquisition metrics, are needed to evaluate needs and determine on-target performance. So this alignment is critical, because without that executive support and leadership, the value an RPO can bring can't really be fully realized. If you think back to that second example that we provided today, the year-over-year increase in value wouldn't have been possible without this type of alignment. In that situation, without executive leadership, the RPO would have had 1 or 2 years of really significant impact on costs and driving those costs down and improving the quality. But then what happens from there? And how do you continue to see in the retail world, they call it same store sales. They want to see that return on investment continuing in the future. So to achieve this type of alignment, and let me give you one example here with one client partnership, we actually went on a listening tour and asked a ton of questions. And in this particular case, we were in front of HR business partners as well as key stakeholders. And in many cases, we were purposely asking different leaders the same questions to see how much variation actually existed. We had to get a real clear understanding of who were the stakeholders, what were their pain points, and what it was that they defined as critical measures of success. We also did a deep dive on data outputs. Was the information that we were generating actually worthy of influencing business decisions, or were we simply using this data to check a box and check it off the checklist that the job was being done? So we had to get the right data to guide the business decisions made by our key stakeholders.
Yeah, and that really speaks to that alignment, right? So, and that's a really good example of how you get that alignment. So, we got about a little less than 10 minutes here, and we really scratched the surface, and you provided a lot of critical components to this, to these these benefits and how you realize these benefits. And really, we started out today talking about the key takeaways, right? So I'm going to remind you of the key takeaways. One is, the structure of an RPO engagement is unique, and I hope you see that, and you've seen, how it is unique to each one of these companies, even though you hear some similar things in every company and many companies today. Very unique. Scalability is key, but it's not the only value. You've heard a lot about efficiency, a lot about technology, a lot about other things you can do to create that ROI. Ongoing, and I hope that you heard, and one of the things that came out loud and clear was ongoing improvement of your recruiting process is key. It's not about a one and done. It's not about just fix this. We have our first example was they have a great recruiting process. It was working pretty well. So, it's about creating that ongoing and also being prepared for what comes next and what changes, I think, is critical as well, because that's, key to this whole thing is what do you do when things change, when your business transforms, like we saw, I guess, in the last example, right? How do you address that? And then the first, this is really a first step in beginning that RPO engagement and really getting the message across that talent is key to accomplishing your business objectives. And if you're really serious about it and you want to have some of the things we have still up here on the screen, right, that alignment and the right data to guide your business decisions, you can connect them to business outcomes for your talent acquisition strategies, and I think that's really key. So, Andy, before we take a couple questions, we have a couple minutes for a couple questions. Do you have anything else you'd like to, kind of summarize for us?
Well, I think intertwined with those key takeaways that you just mentioned, I think there's a couple key points that were themes within some of the examples that we used today, and one is that getting started in an RPO engagement doesn't have to be complex. And for those companies that are joining us today and considering that, you can rely on your RPO partner to build the initial business case as well as set the stage for continuous improvement. And quite frankly, there should be expectations in there that at different intervals, you're going to be able to see that continuous improvement. I think the second thing to build on that is really that continuous improvement and the full value realization is possible as your RPO relationship and your partnership evolves. So I think we touched on it, but it's worth echoing one more time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one too. Okay, so before we run out of time here, let's take a few questions. I've got one here for you. And you'll see also that we have some additional resources from the RPOA. We've done a couple of these ours and can help you, get some more information. But one of the questions I have for you, Andy, here is how did internal recruiters react when the RPO provider was brought in? Is there this panic and everybody leaving, or what's going on? How did that work when you came in?
So we've actually had a couple different scenarios where as the RPO is engaged, there is the question about how to actually transform or, what's actually going to happen with the recruiters in place. And we went through a couple different examples today where, and let me start with the first one. In the first situation, let me start with the second one where they had the HR department actually doing recruiting tasks. That one's a little bit simpler. The reality is that those HR people were able to actually focus on their HR tasks. So there was no issues there. In the first one, which is a little bit more complex, there was a situation where there was probably a good deal of confusion and worry on the part of the recruiters. And one of the things that we do right out of the gates is address this with our client partners during implementation to make sure that that communication is there and there's not a worry about what's going to happen. Now, in some cases, in our engagements with clients, we're actually able to bring those recruiters on board onto our team and have them as YO employees providing service to the client. And in those particular situations, which are the best of all situations to be in, we're able to, again, provide a seamless transition for those recruiters.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? So that's got to help in that process. But yeah, I think that's a common question I think I've heard over time as you've gone through. I guess in some cases it's not a problem when they don't have the recruiting resources, but when you're transitioning there, it's an issue. So here's another question. I think it's I'm going to skip around here. That it's kind of related. So what about the head or whoever's running talent acquisition? When you coming in or RPO coming in, is that a threat? And I assume that means that kind of a threat to their career, their power, or what they have in place. How does speak to how that works when you come in?
Yeah, same question, different level, right? And it's actually the answer to that question is exactly the entire opposite. Our goal is to actually work with that talent acquisition leader and to put them in a position where they can gain a lot more credibility. In our examples today, a lot of what we talked about was getting that seat at the table and being a strategic partner with the business. And that is actually led by our sponsor, who is that talent acquisition leader. So that person still plays a critical role. That person is really the person that is bringing these two groups together and setting the strategic direction and pulling all those teams together. I mean, it's really the most critical position, and there's absolutely no threat to their role whatsoever.
Makes sense. Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Hopefully we've given you a few practical examples. Andy, thank you. That was some great stuff as usual. I appreciate it. We'd like to thank the RPOA for all their help in putting on this webinar. And Lamese, thank you and our audience today for joining us and for the questions. And again, if there's any other resources, check the RPOA and then yo.com. And you can find plenty of resources there as well. All right, Lamese, any final comments?
No, wonderful. Thank you, Andy and Matt. Wonderful presentation. I was sitting at the edge of my seat the whole time, and excellent job.
All right.
Thank you all for attending as well. Have a great day.
Thanks, Lamese.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.